Welcome to Lesson 2, or Day 2 of Lesson 9.1, in which we're going to learn how to find the least common denominator for rational expressions. We're going to use the same fraction rules of adding fractions with different denominators when we change them to rational expressions. So here's an example, 1/5 plus 1/2. In order to add these, we need to find a common denominator. The easiest way to find your common denominator is to think of factors. So here we have a factor of 5. So for my least common denominator, I'm going to need a factor of 5. Looking at the second quantity, I need a factor of 2. So if I multiply the two factors together, 5 times 2, I get my least common denominator of 10. And then by simply multiplying by 2 over 2 times 1/5, I get that common denominator of 10, and 1/2 times 5 over 5 gives me that common denominator of 10. Remember that we multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same amount because 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we've not changed the value of the fraction 1/5, we're simply rewriting it with a different denominator. So as we continue to add and subtract rational expressions, we're going to have to create common denominators if we don't already have them. All right, before we jump into the first example of finding the least common denominator, two things I always want you to start with. The first, put parentheses around any numerator or denominator quantities that have to remain together. So this x plus 5, that is a quantity that must remain together unless I can factor it out further. Secondly, factor any numerator or denominator that can be factored further. So certainly look for a GCF. Those are the easiest ones to miss. And then let's say if you have a trinomial or difference of squares, you want to go ahead and factor both the numerator and denominator to assist us with our simplifying and adding and subtracting. So looking at both of these examples, x and x plus 5, those are factored as far as we can go. So now we can focus on finding the least common denominator. So we're going to look at the first quantity and look at the denominator and say, well, I need a factor of x. Looking at the second quantity, I'm going to need a factor of x plus 5. Now please realize that x plus 5 is not the same as an x. These are two separate factors. So we're going to need one of each. So I can simply write this as x times x plus 5. Now you may be thinking, do I need to multiply that out? And it's actually better not to multiply out this least common denominator when we start to try to find, to do our math and to add these together. And let me show you why. And we're not going to go through this step today, but just to show you what's coming up here, we would then multiply this quantity 3 over x by a factor of x plus 5. And we'd multiply the 3 over x plus 5 by a quantity of x. And it's best if I go ahead and put those parentheses in there. And you can see where that's headed, in which we would have to distribute and then add like terms. All right, example 2, first step, I need to add those parentheses around the quantity x minus 8 and then around the quantity x minus 5. I'm going to look to see, can I factor any further? And no, I cannot factor the numerator or the denominator any further. So now I need to find my lowest common denominator. So my least common denominator, I need a factor of x minus 8 times this factor, x minus 5. And again, we're going to leave it in factored form. Do not multiply it out or it just makes more steps for you. So this is my least common denominator. And that's what our focus is today, is to simply find that least common denominator. But I want to show you how we're going to use that in the near future. Since we want a common denominator of x minus 8 and x minus 5, we just simply multiply this first quantity by x minus 5 over x minus 5 and multiply the second quantity by x minus 8 over x minus 8. And just to be consistent here, I would need parentheses around those units. Example 3, again, I'm going to start by adding those parentheses. I'm going to remind you that in every video. Can I factor any of these further? No, I cannot factor them any further. So my least common denominator, I'm going to need a factor of x minus 3. And I'm going to need a factor of x, and I'm just going to put that x in front. And there I have my least common denominator. All right, example 4 is a quiz question. This one I want you to attempt by yourself and check your answer. All right, example 5. This one's a little bit different because we have this quantity 1 over x minus 6 plus 2x here. So if that bothers you with that 2x not being a rational expression, we can create it. We can just put it over 1. And then it looks more like a rational expression. So I'm going to start by putting my parentheses around x minus 6, finding my least common denominator. I'm going to need a factor of x minus 6, and I'm going to need a factor of 1. Well, 1 times x minus 6 is simply x minus 6. So this would be my least common denominator. All right, in example 6, here we get to those more interesting rational expressions. So I'm going to start by adding my parentheses. So I need to put it around this entire quantity, x squared plus x minus 6, and around the quantity x plus 3. So my second step then is to say, hey, can I factor any of these further? And I can definitely factor this denominator. So I'm going to rewrite that as 3x over, since it's a trinomial, I have x times x gives me x squared. And then I need two numbers that multiply to give me negative 6, but add to give me that positive 1 there. So I believe those are the numbers 3 and 2, with the 3 being positive and the 2 being negative. And then I bring down the second expression. And now I can try to find my lowest common denominator. So looking at the first term, or the first expression, I'm going to need factors of x plus 3 and x minus 2. Looking at the second term, I need a factor of x plus 3. Well, I already have a factor of x plus 3, so I don't need to add a second one. So this is my least common denominator, x plus 3 times x minus 2. Example 7 is a quiz question. Work this one out yourself and see if you can get the right answer. All right, here's the correct answer. Did you remember to put parentheses around all these quantities? And then factor the denominator. And we end up with a least common denominator of x plus 8 times x minus 4. I hope you feel a little bit more confident about finding the least common denominator now of rational expressions. You're going to get some practice with it, and then in our next lesson, our next video, we're actually going to add and subtract these expressions.